In the heart of a sprawling, overcrowded city, everyone is looking for a bargain. For a struggling student named Eris, finding a spacious room for less than half the market rate felt like a miracle. The boarding house, or kos as locals call it, was tucked away at the end of a dead-end alley, hidden behind overgrown vines and a rusting iron gate. It was a gray, monolithic structure that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. The air around the building felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete, and something else, something metallic and old. Eris didn't care about the atmosphere, he only cared about the price. He signed the handwritten contract without a second thought, ignoring the way the ink seemed to bleed into the paper like a bruise.
The landlord was a man named Mr. Bascoro, an elderly figure with skin like parchment and eyes that never quite met yours. He moved with a silent, gliding gait that felt unnatural. When he handed over the heavy iron key, his fingers were ice cold. He gave Eris only 2 rules: never enter the basement under any circumstances, and never light candles in the room after midnight. Eris laughed it off as the eccentricities of an old man, thinking it was just about fire safety or a messy cellar. But as he moved his boxes into the room on the 3rd floor, he noticed the walls were unusually thick, and the window was barred from the outside. The silence in the hallway was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to swallow the sound of his footsteps.
The first few nights were uneventful, yet Eris couldn't sleep. The room was cold, despite the tropical heat outside. By the 4th night, the sounds began. It wasn't the typical scratching of rats or the settling of an old building. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. If he pressed his ear to the wall, he could hear what sounded like dozens of voices whispering in a synchronized, guttural chant. It was a language he didn't recognize, harsh, sibilant, and full of sharp consonants. The chanting would start exactly at midnight and cease just before the first light of dawn. He tried to tell himself it was just a nearby mosque or a temple, but the sound was coming from directly beneath him, deep within the foundation of the house. Curiosity eventually overcame fear. One afternoon, while Mr. Bascoro was out, Aris decided to investigate the source of the vibrations. He found a loose floorboard beneath his bed. Prying it up, he didn't find dust or insulation. Instead, he found a hollow space containing a small leather-bound ledger and a collection of Polaroid photographs. The photos were chilling. They depicted the very room he was living in, but the furniture was gone. In its place stood a tall, hooded figure, surrounded by previous tenants, people Aris recognized from the missing posters he'd seen around the neighborhood. They weren't smiling. Their eyes were wide with a glazed, hypnotic intensity. The ledger was filled with names and dates, each entry ending with the same phrase written in red: "The vessel is prepared." Driven by a desperate need to know the truth, Eris broke the first rule. He waited until the house was silent and made his way to the basement door. The heavy padlock was surprisingly easy to pick, as if it wanted to be opened. As the door creaked back, a wave of sickeningly sweet incense and the iron tang of blood hit him. He descended a narrow stone staircase into a circular chamber that looked centuries older than the rest of the building. The walls were adorned with intricate, disturbing murals of celestial bodies being consumed by shadows. In the center of the room stood a black stone altar, stained with dark, dried fluids. Around it were 12 chairs, each carved with the same symbols he had seen in the ledger. This was not a basement. It was a cathedral for something ancient and hungry. As he stood in the center of the ritual chamber, the temperature plummeted. The low humming he heard at night began to manifest in the air around him, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He realized then that the low rent wasn't a bargain, it was bait. The boarding house was a trap designed to lure in those who wouldn't be missed, providing a steady stream of vessels for the cult's activities. He saw a pile of personal belongings in the corner, a watch, a pair of glasses, a student ID. They belonged to the girl who had lived in his room before him. She hadn't moved out. She had been absorbed into whatever happens in this dark room. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was the next sacrifice in their dark calendar. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. From the top of the stairs, he heard the slow, deliberate click of the basement door being locked from the outside. Then, the heavy footsteps of Mr. Bascoro began to descend. Eris scrambled to find a place to hide, but the room was an open circle. He realized the landlord wasn't alone. Multiple shadows stretched across the stairs, accompanied by the sound of many feet. The cult was arriving for their midnight session early. Panic surged through him, a primal fight-or-flight response. He noticed a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. With the adrenaline of a dying man, he stacked 2 chairs against the wall and leaped for the opening just as the first hooded figure entered the room. The crawl through the ventilation ducts was a blur of claustrophobia and terror. He could hear them below, their voices rising in a frantic, dissonant scream as they realized the vessel had escaped the altar. He pushed through cobwebs and sharp metal edges, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, the duct led him to an exterior grate overlooking the alleyway. He kicked it open and tumbled 2 stories down into a pile of trash. He didn't stop to check for broken bones. He ran. He ran until the gray building was a distant silhouette against the city lights, and he didn't stop until he reached the brightly lit lobby of a police station miles away. His clothes were torn, his hands were bleeding, and his mind was fractured by what he had seen. The police investigation that followed was frustratingly inconclusive. By the time they arrived at the address, the boarding house was empty. Not just the people, but everything. The furniture was gone, the altar had been dismantled, and the walls in the basement had been freshly plastered and painted white. There was no sign of Mr. Bascoro or any other residents. The property records showed the building was owned by a shell company that hadn't existed for 20 years. To the authorities, Otis looked like a student having a mental breakdown, but Otis knew what he saw. He still has the Polaroid he tucked into his pocket, the one showing the hooded figure in his room. On the back of the photo, a single line of text had appeared that wasn't there before. "We are always watching the threshold." Eris never went back for his belongings. He moved to another province far from the city, but the experience changed him forever. He can no longer sleep in total silence, and he never enters a building that feels too quiet. His story serves as a grim warning to anyone searching for a deal that seems too good to be true. In a world where space is a luxury, some landlords aren't looking for your money. They are looking for your presence to fill a void that should never have been opened. If you find a room with a price that defies logic, look closer at the walls. You might find that the previous tenant never actually left. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates on true mysteries and urban legends. Stay safe and keep your eyes open.